back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I'm still talking about Modern Horizons 3 here. Obviously, there's a ton to talk about. This is an incredibly impactful set, probably for a lot of formats, but just talking about Commander, this might be the most impactful set we've ever seen for Commander, as far as just the cards that everyone's going to be going after, the auto includes, the strict upgrades, all of that kind of stuff. And I've already made a video. In fact, I made a few videos already because as the spoilers were coming out, I saw so many cards that were going to be played in the Commander format that I'm like, oh man, I better break this up a little because I'm going to end up having to make a 3-hour video talking about all the cards from this set that go in every Commander deck. I already made a video talking about the flares, which we are definitely going to see a ton of in the format. I made a video about the MDFC lands. There's a ton of MDFC lands in this set that are obviously a land on the back, and then on the front, a very playable Commander card. Those we're going to see a ton. I already made my first video talking about essentially the review of the set, the 99 cards that are just Commander staples right out of the gate that we're going to see a ton. And I am sure, and I know there's a lot of people that commented on that video, where's this card? What about this card? What about yeah, there's too many, guys. There's too many cards that are right out of the gate Commander staples to talk about in a single video. I don't know if any other content creator out there is going to try to tackle this whole set in a single video. I don't know how long that would be. But again, I'm even going to skip over a ton of stuff that I'm sure people are excited about because I'm just talking about the stuff that we're for sure going to see play in the Commander format. The first video I did was essentially the really stapley stuff. And then this stuff as well is also really stapley stuff, to be quite honest. Let's start out again with the lands, which of course, lands are the easiest thing to really become Commander staples because of course they're so easy to slot into decks. I already talked about land cycles in the other video, and there's a bunch more to talk about here. I'll start off with this cycle that they did of these 3-color lands, and it's an interesting one for sure. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I don't even know how popular that's going to be. It's certainly going to see play. They have cycling, they're tapping for colorless mana, but they're also doing sort of that Evolving Wilds thing. And we know what my opinion is on Evolving Wilds. First of all, you shouldn't be playing it in a green deck, so I don't think I would play any of this land cycle that is in a green deck, because again, green does the ramping, mana fixing thing so well already, I don't know if you need it. Let's take a look at a non-green one, Contaminated Landscape. So it's a land, taps for colorless mana, which is not great. Right out of the gate, I'm not loving it, because you have a 3-color land that's tapping for colorless mana. So yeah, it doesn't enter the battlefield tapped, which is good. So that makes it better than an Evolving Wilds, because of course Evolving Wilds, even though it enters the battlefield untapped, you can't use it right away because it's getting a land that enters the battlefield tapped. Here you can actually use it. You can play this turn 1 to cast your Soul Ring or something. You can't do that with Evolving Wilds. So I guess that does kind of make it better. And you can sacrifice it to go get a Plains, Island, or Swamp. So you can only get those 3, but obviously you're putting it in an Esper deck, so that's the only ones that you want. Basic Plains, Island, and Swamp, I should obviously clarify, that makes a big difference. You can't go get a Triome with this. You can only get a basic, and you are putting it into play tapped. So it is essentially the same as an Evolving Wilds, except it has that tap to add colorless, which makes it better. Still, though, not super great, and it has the cycling white, blue, and a black, which of course means you can only play it in a deck that has those colors, which, you know, how often are you going to be doing that? I don't know. That is a really pricey cycling ability. Having to pay 3 to cycle already is not good, but having to pay 3 colors as well is really bad. So that is something you're not going to be using very often, I imagine. I mean, it is a nice added little bonus that you can use later in the game. I mean, it's better than Evolving Wilds. I'll just say that. How much play are these going to actually see, though? I'm not exactly sure. They're okay. Let's get to some lands that are definitely going to see a ton of play. And again, some of these lands are ones that people are like, wow, you should have included those in the Commander Staples, auto includes videos, because these are a couple of lands here that are really easy to slot into decks. So Horizon of Progress, which is, I'm sure, one that is getting quite a bit of buzz. Tap, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. So it is doing that reflecting pool thing, and I I like Reflecting Pool. I don't have it in any decks myself. I don't see it a lot. It's a pretty good land. It is one that can be a little difficult. This is doing that effect. That's why I'm talking about it. It is helpful to be able to add 1 mana that any land you control could produce. However, in a mana fixing situation, it's not super great because, of course, you're only adding mana that you already have. If you need a color of mana, you're not going to get it off this land, right? It's got other stuff, though, and some pretty good stuff here. Pay 3 and tap. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Tap. Hey, look at that. So it is a terrain generator, essentially a funny old land that used to get played in the Commander format quite a bit that we don't really see anymore. And so for that reason, again, I'm less excited about this because I don't know how often you're going to be using that. Also, though, another ability, pay 1, tap, sacrifice Horizon, progress to draw a card. So that's pretty good too. So the fact that this has 3 pretty decent abilities, I think a lot of people are going to put it in a lot of their decks. None of this is really blowing me away. I'm not going to go out of my way to find room for this in any of my decks unless for some reason I really want to be doing any of these. I mean, I do have a sacrifice lands deck, so I could just, sacrifice this draw card, but don't really have any room to find a card like this that's not giving me any more advantage that I want. I don't know. It's a toughie. This actually is a card that you look at and a lot of people probably are super excited about it and for sure want to grab a copy. And I'm thinking it's just okay. It's pretty good. A lot better, though, a card that I'm a little more excited about, and probably, again, a lot of people are getting really excited about, Talon Gates of Madara, which is a gate. So if you got a Gates deck, there's an easy slot in, obviously. Has a very unique ability. And again, this is another one that I'm sure a lot of people are like, oh, you should have included in that first video, but I do think it's a little fringe. And this would be one that I would I'm going to probably spend more time talking people out of rather than trying to convince them to go out and buy it. When Talon Gates of Madara enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature phases out. That is very interesting. Very interesting. Of course, it also taps to add a colorless, pay 1 and tap, add 1 mana of any color. So all of that is, whatever. It's one of those lands. It's one of those lands that taps for colorless and you can filter mana essentially if you really, really need to. That's not really the important part that needs to be talked about here. The important part is the fact that it phases out a creature, and also you can pay 4 to put it from your hand onto the battlefield, which is the part that I'm sure a lot of people are getting excited about. So there's 2 reasons why obviously that's good. The reason that it is ramp essentially, which is not great ramp. I mean, 4 mana, put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. That ain't great. It is usable though, certainly. The big part here, though, is the phasing part. And of course, because you can activate that ability at instant speed, this is in a colorless option, right? Of course, the fact that this is colorless means it can go in a lot more decks. This is a colorless option to protect a creature. And of course, phasing is the best way to protect a creature. So this is 4 mana, instant speed. I put this thing into play because my opponent just cast a farewell and I phase out my commander. Pretty great way to protect your creature. Now, I will just say, okay, I'll say a couple of things. Again, now I'm going to try to talk you out of this card. I do like this card. It is really neat. Phasing obviously is great in the Commander format. Plaza of Heroes is a card that I got super excited when it first came out. Again, I like protecting my stuff. It's something that every Commander deck needs, especially if you're in colors like red that doesn't protect your stuff very well. Having it on a land is extra good. I immediately grabbed a few copies of Plaza of Heroes, threw it in a few of my decks. I have yet to use that ability, the one on the bottom that gives your commander or whatever creature hexproof and indestructible. I haven't used it. Not once have I used that ability on that land in any of my decks. Just saying. Now, this is a little different. However, I'm thinking when I look at this card, you could get in some neat situations where you can play it and phase out your opponent's creature, because this does work on any creature, so that you can get in for damage. There are some niche scenarios like that. You really have to keep in mind, though, that I do want to play this as a land. You have this in your opening hand, and turn 3, I just got to make a land drop. Now I don't want to phase out any creature. I mean, you could, but it's not probably going to do you any good. A lot of people will go through the great scenarios for this, but ultimately, I think that a lot of times you're just going to play this as a land, and the phasing thing isn't going to matter. And obviously, the putting it from your hand onto the battlefield isn't going to matter. So it's just going to be a land that taps for colorless mana. It is a gate, obviously, so the gate decks are going to probably auto-include it. It's very unique because in certain situations it can be fantastic, but in other situations, it's just not a very good land at all, right? This is one that I think, Sure, it's good, and sure, I love how unique it is, but just be cautious not to just run out and throw it in every deck. Okay, Sunken Palace, a card that I'm sure a lot of people are going to be excited about. It is a land cave. So they did the land types thing a lot in this set. Enters the battlefield taps to add a blue. So again, fits into that category. Has an ability that I'm sure a lot of people are going to love. 1 and a blue, and tap, exile 7 cards from your graveyard. So you do have to have quite a bit in your graveyard before you can use this. Add a blue. So you're losing mana. That's not great. When you spend this mana to cast a spell or activate an ability, copy that spell or ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. So yeah, you're losing a mana here, but who cares, right? This is a way on a land to copy a spell or ability. Wow. So again, I wouldn't say it's an auto include, but certainly, obviously, it goes in blue decks. I think there's a ton of people that are going to run out and grab this because the possibility to, use this kind of effect later in the game can be really, really good. This is going to be a popular card in the format for sure. All right, we are through the lands, and of course, there is a massive Eldrazi theme in this set. I'm not going to cover it all. I will cover a few. If you already had an Eldrazi deck, you should certainly be checking out this set to see if there's any cards that will fit in your deck. However, funny enough, a lot of the Eldrazi cards from this set have a colored mana symbol. I mean, they have the mostly useless Devoid ability, which means they're technically colorless, because in Commander, the pips actually matter. If you have a colorless Eldrazi tribal sort of deck that you've had for a long, long time, a lot of the cards, and funny enough, even some of them are actually Eldrazi tribal cards, aren't going to fit in your deck because they're colored cards. However, there are a few that are just good cards, not Eldrazi tribal at all, like Angelic Aberration, 5 and a white, Eldrazi Angel 4/4, Devoid, of course, Flying, and Vigilance. When Angelic Aberration enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of creatures with base power or toughness 1 or less. Create that many 4/4 colorless Eldrazi Angel creature tokens of Flying and Vigilance. So that's pretty good. There might be a few places where people might think to play this. Obviously, the toughness or power 1 or less thing is likely specifically meant for those Eldrazi spawn, which of course you can sacrifice those and turn them all into angels. But this is also a pretty good fit, I think, in any deck where you have a lot of 1/1 creatures lying around. I mean, it's got to be white, but Soldier Tribal, something like that. So can be pretty good in a deck like that. Eldritch Immunity, 1 colorless mana, Kindred instant, Eldrazi. Target creature you control gains protection from each color until end of turn. And I mean, this annoys me about the colorless thing in general because, what they did with colorless, and I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here. Colorless essentially is a new color, right? What they did with colorless is they essentially created a new color in the game of Magic without actually creating a new color. I mean, it is essentially a color. You need that pip to cast it. It also has its own basic land, so it's essentially its own color. And now they even have their own snow-covered basic lands. If you weren't aware of that, they have this in this set as well. And what I don't love about it, typically in the game of Magic before colorless came along, when you just had like artifacts, generic mana stuff, there wasn't really a theme there. It sort of just did everything. So they adopted that with colorless. So colorless just does whatever it wants. It can break the color pie all it wants because it doesn't really fit into the color pie, right? So that's what kind of annoys me about the Eldrazi stuff and the colorless stuff is they just do whatever they want. A colorless card, you can do whatever you want. Everything can be a color pie break because you don't actually have to fit into the color pie. It annoys me a little. So this is a colorless card that is giving target creature you control protection from each color until end of turn. Obviously a phenomenal way to protect a creature in a colorless form, but also has overload for a colorless. So for 5 mana at instant speed, you can give all your creatures protection from each color until end of turn. Can be really fantastic for protecting your creature. It also is great for getting in for damage, right? Because your creatures essentially become unblockable. Obviously, again, a card that auto-includes in every colorless deck, I guess, but also goes in a lot of other decks as well. Like a lot of monocolor decks might want to play this, possibly. And again, Kozilek's Command, another colorless card that's probably going to go in every colorless deck, and people might try to find room for it in monocolor decks as well. So X and 2 colorless mana, Kindred instant Eldrazi. Choose 2 modes. Target player creates X01 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens. Target player scries X, then draws a card. Exile target creature with mana value X or less. Exile up to X target cards from graveyard. So it's graveyard hate, it's removal, it's sort of card draw, and it also creates a bunch of tokens, which obviously you can sacrifice. So it's essentially ramp, right? It kind of works like a ritual effect. I guess also can get you a ton of dice triggers like this card is doing so much. And modal cards are really great in the commander format because you never know what's going to happen. And this being an instant, you can react at instant speed, obviously, right? There is also a ton of energy cards in this set. I cannot talk about all of them. In fact, I'm not going to talk about any of them except for this one because this is the one that most easily can be slotted into any deck. Solar Transformer. You don't need to be playing an energy deck here at all, okay? 2 mana artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, it gives you 3 energy. Taps to add a colorless, so it is a mana rock. It is a 2 mana mana rock, enters the battlefield tapped, and taps for a colorless, which already throughout the history of Commander, a lot of people played cards like that. So this would be an easy slot in for people, but you can tap it and pay an energy to add 1 mana of any color. So pretty good mana rock, I think, in the Commander format. This comes into play, gives you 3 energy, which essentially, again, outside of an energy deck, gives you 3 uses for that last ability. You can sit there tapping it for colorless mana when you don't really need the colors, but whenever you do need the colors, you got 3 energy that you can use for it. I think this is a pretty darn good mana rock that, outside of the energy theme, can be used in any commander deck. Let's get to another card that I'm sure a lot of people thought was going to be a card I would talk about in the first video because it is probably going to see a ton of play in the commander format. Warren Soul Trader, 2 and a black, zombie goblin wizard. So it's already got 3, some of the most popular creature types in the entire format. So zombie tribal, goblin tribal, or wizard tribal. This can go in all of those. 3/3, pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, create a treasure token. Yikes. So this is a repeatable way. I mean, it's a repeatable sack outlet and also a repeatable treasure token maker. I mean, come on, this card is pretty insane. Goes in so many themes because it is both a great sack outlet and a great treasure token maker and also a zombie goblin and wizard. This is going to be a really popular card in the commander format, and I imagine it's going to be an expensive one as well. A card that fits really, really nicely with it is Marionette Apprentice, 1 and a black, human artificer, 1/2. And if you ever thought your Marionette Master was way too expensive for your deck that you want to be sacrificing artifacts in, have no fear. Fabricate 1, of course, which means you can put a +1/+1 counter on it, or you can make a servo token. Likely, I think in this case, you're definitely going to want to make the servo token because whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So it is doing that drain effect for both your creatures and artifacts. So boy, does this ever go fantastically with that Warren Soul Trader. Another card that just so easily slots into so many decks. Again, I don't want to call this a strict upgrade. It is, you know, in a way it's better because it's dealing with both creatures and artifacts, which you don't see much. It's only 2 mana. So I don't know. I think a lot of people would consider this a strict upgrade to a Marionette Master for that reason, but would also consider it a strict upgrade to other options that only deal with creatures or only deal with artifacts. Ton of decks this is going to go in. Another card that a lot of people might be buzzing about is Vexing Bauble. It's an interesting one for sure. 1 mana artifact. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. And for all those people out there that hate those free counter spells and are going to hate seeing all those flares in the format, this is a way to get around it, right? If people aren't paying mana for spells, it will get countered. Also, if you do the, reveal card from top of your library and you may cast it for free or exile something from your opponents and then cast it for free, any of those effects, right? Which of course there's a lot of those in the format. This is going to shut that stuff down. And also you can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it to draw a card. So it is never going to be a dead draw. It's never going to be a useless card. And also you can essentially get rid of it if you want to cast something for free, right? So really handy that way. I will just point out that Void Mirror is a card that came out quite a while ago. Funny enough, in the last Modern Horizons set, Modern Horizons 2, whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell, which is a little bit different and might be a lot more relevant now, actually, funny enough. This hits free spells as well, because of course, no mana was spent to cast them. And that was a card that I talked about when I talked about the best cards from that set, and I never see it. I have never seen that card in a Commander game. Nobody plays it. So that's why I was less excited. I know Vexing Bauble is probably better, but I mean, it's certainly a card that's going to see play, but because it's kind of niche, might not see a lot of play. Definitely worth talking about, though. Let's talk about Siege Smash. Again, with the strict upgrades. I consider this to be a strict upgrade anyway. 1 and a red, instant, has split second, which of course is fantastic in the Commander format because your opponents can't respond to it. Choose one, destroy target artifact, or target creature gets +3/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So this could be considered a strict upgrade to a couple of cards. I would say it's better than an Abrade. I know people might disagree with that. The one deck I have Abrade in, which is my Bralin deck, it is a better fit. It has the split second. Obviously, the destroy artifact is the same. Some people might like the 3 mana removal for a creature. That's okay. I find I don't use it a lot. I like this better. It fits better with my commander. +3/+2 and trample. And again, got the split second, so your opponents won't be able to counter this or respond to it. So giving my commander +3/+2 and trample after it's gotten really, really big, it can be really, really good. Maybe not a strict upgrade. This definitely is a card that can see play in a lot of decks, though. Another card that I'm sure is getting a lot of buzz. It's a funny one for sure. Rampant Frogua. 2 and a green frog, 3/3 with trample. Rampant Frogua gets +10/+10 for each player who lost the game. That's pretty funny. Obviously, if someone has lost the game, this will be a 13/13. And if 2 players have lost the game, this will be a 23/23. Pretty ridiculous. Also has trample, of course. When Rampant Frogua deals combat damage to a player, you may mill that many cards. Put any number of land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped. So where is this going to see play? I would say in a lands thing where you want lands to be going to your graveyard. I mean, you could put it in any deck. I mean, honestly, ignoring the lose the game stipulation, 3/3 creature with trample. You could easily put this in a deck where you are like putting counters on your creatures, making them bigger, all that kind of stuff, because you deal damage to a player and mill that many cards and then put that many lands from among them onto the battlefield tapped. It's a fantastic ramping option. I imagine early in the game, you can get this guy out turn 3, start attacking with it. And, if I can get in for, and not have a blocker in the way, I'm hitting for 3. And if you don't mind yourself getting milled, a Sidisi deck, slam dunk in that deck. I think there's probably a few commanders that want you to be dumping stuff in your graveyard anyway, but also you're ramping. You're likely going to hit a land in those top 3 cards. You could whiff from time to time, but you're already getting in for damage, so there's no downside here. And then if someone loses the game, this guy now becomes a 13/13. And of course, it's a removal magnet. You got to get it off the table, but if someone doesn't right away, things are going to get really out of hand really fast. This is a funny card. It's definitely a unique one, and it certainly is one that a lot of people are going to run out and buy and shoehorn into a bunch of decks just because they want to get to that point where one person's lost the game, so their Rampant Frogua gets enormous and even maybe more enormous after that. Definitely going to see play on the format for sure. Clipping along, and my last video was 40 minutes long, and I'm sure this is going to be even longer. Silver Quill Lecturer, 5 and a white core wizard, 3/3. Creature spells you cast have demonstrate. Very interesting. This is a very unique card for sure. It's certainly going to see some play in the format. Where exactly, I'm not sure. A lot of people might just shoehorn this into their decks for value. It is a good value card, but maybe a better fit in a politics deck if you have that. Where exactly does this fit? I don't know. I mean, obviously the demonstrate how it works is I'm going to cast a creature spell and I may copy it. And of course, the copy becomes a token. If you do, you choose an opponent to also copy it. And very important to clarify here, your opponent is not copying one of their creatures or one of their creature spells. They're copying yours. So you are giving your opponent whatever creature you're casting. That is very important to note. This is great in the politics situation, though, where let's say you got one guy who's just way ahead of everybody else. And I have a Rec Sage that I want to cast. So I cast a Rec Sage because he's got some really powerful enchantment I want to get rid of. But he's also got a really powerful artifact I want to get rid of. And he's also got another really powerful enchantment I want to get rid of. So I make a deal with this guy over here, some other opponent, and say, hey man, I'm going to copy my Rec Sage. You get one as well. It essentially becomes a Druid of Purification, right? Where you're just going to hit all those troublesome artifacts and enchantments on the battlefield, right? That's where a card like this can be really neat and certainly very useful. I have already talked about White of the Reliquary. It is certainly a card that's going to see play in a lot of decks in the Commander format. Black and a green. Zombie Knight 2/2 with Vigilance. White of the Reliquary gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. That fits in a lot of themes. Tap, sacrifice another creature, search your library for a land card, and put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So this fits in a bunch of themes. Namely, it fits in the graveyard decks in Golgari. And obviously, you probably want creature cards in your graveyard, and you probably also want to be sacrificing creatures. What lands are you going to go get? Who cares? Any land. I mean, you likely have a Urborg or Cobalt Coffers in your black-green deck anyway, but you can just get any land. I mean, what does it matter what you're getting? Even if you just get a basic forest, this is still ramping, right? So it's already good. This guy's even got Vigilance, so as he gets bigger, you can still attack with him and then use his ability on someone else's turn if you want to. Fantastic value. Again, great in the lands theme, but also in the sacrifice creatures theme. Gonna go in a bunch of decks for sure. All right, Hourglass of the Lost, and every single review of every single set I have done for sure over a year, I have talked about that 3 mana value mana rock that can easily slot into so many decks because we're already in the situation where, you know, almost everyone has a 3 mana rock in their deck that is giving them mana, but also likely doing some other great thing. And of course, that is the case here. This is a white one though, 2 and a white artifact. So got to play in a white deck, obviously. Taps to add a white, so it's giving you the white mana you need. Put a time counter on Hourglass of the Lost. So as you're tapping it, as you're just using it as you normally would, you're also putting time counters on it, of course, because it's using counters. Might fit better in some of those themes. Tap, remove X time counters from Hourglass of the Lost and exile it. Return each non-land permanent card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. Wow, that's a fantastic added bonus for your mana rock that you're going to put in your deck anyway to just tap for mana, right? And I know people will say, oh, your opponent's just going to remove it before you use it. Okay, but it's a mana rock, and I just made my opponent use their removal spell. I wouldn't rely entirely on this. I'm not going to make it so that I'm sitting here waiting for this to get in a certain number so I can get something out of my graveyard and I'm relying on this card to get stuff. No, I wouldn't do that. I would just, it's free value. You just get to a point where, okay, I don't need a mana rock anymore. I'll just sacrifice this and get a couple things out of my graveyard. Maybe you just see something in your graveyard like a Smothering Tithe, and I have my Hourglass of the Lost with 4 counters on it. I'll sacrifice it just to get that one thing back, right? You don't have to get everything back with this. You can just get one thing back with it. So definitely a card that can easily slot into a lot of decks without a doubt. Emperor of Bones, 1 and a black skeleton noble 2/2 at the beginning of combat on your turn. Exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So graveyard hate, need it in every deck. This is not the best version ever, but it is decent. And exiling stuff from graveyards repeatedly can be really good. It has adapt. Pay 1 and a black, adapt 2. So of course, we're going to pay the 1 and a black. And if it has no counters on it already, you're going to put 2 counters on it. Yes, they brought back the adaptability in this set. Not the greatest ability ever. One that was sort of dunked on a little bit because it wasn't very unique or interesting. But they brought it back nonetheless. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Emperor of Bones, put a creature card exiled with Emperor of Bones onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Pretty great ability. So essentially for 4 mana, you're getting a creature from a graveyard into play, and you're putting a finality counter on it, you're sacrificing it. That can be great value, but of course, where you really want to be playing this is in decks where you can repeatedly use that ability, because of course you keep exiling stuff from graveyards every turn, but the adapt only works just the once. I guess if you're in a deck like the deck I just made, where you can remove counters from creatures, it both works with the adapt, removing that counter, and it also works with the finality counter. So this would be a slam dunk in that deck. But if you can just have some deck where you're putting like an Embrose deck, there you go. In fact, that was the commander for that deck. So what a slam dunk it is in an Embrose deck, I think. Embrose can just repeatedly be putting counters on your Emperor of Bones, and this just says whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on it. So you just keep using that ability over and over again, right? The same can be said for Evolution Witness, 2 and a green Elf Shaman Mutant 2/1, and again has 1 and a green Adapt 2. Whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on an Evolution Witness, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So of course it's doing the Eternal Witness thing. Not great though, it's only dealing with permanent cards, which I'm glad to say they've been doing more and more in green. I think it is more fair that green only gets to return permanents from graveyard to your hand. It shouldn't be able to return instant sorceries. Of course, Eternal Witness does whatever, and Regrowth does whatever, but I think the fair non-color pie break way to do it is green gets to return a permanence from your graveyard to your hand. Now, of course, not as good as either of those other effects, but again, in that +1/+1 counter theme is repeatable. You can use the adapt to do it once, but then any deck where you're just, putting counters on your creatures every turn, which I don't know how many decks there are in green, but there's got to be a whole ton of those where you can easily put counters on your creature. Every time you do so, you're getting a permanent back from your graveyard, and you might even be able to get into some combo-y situations with this card as well. So I'm not throwing this card in every deck, but it certainly fits in those decks that are in the +1/+1 counter theme. Moving along to Argent Dais, and this is definitely one that is getting some buzz because, of course, again, every set gets a great new white removal option, and this is a pretty great one, I think. 1 and a white artifact enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it, so we're revisiting the oil counter thing if you happen to have a deck that's doing that. But again, because it's doing counters, proliferate, any of that will work as well. Whenever 2 or more creatures attack, put an oil counter on Argent Dais. And of course, that's anyone's creatures. Whenever 2 or more creatures attack, yours, your opponent's, whatever. So again, maybe you're in that theme. I have a patron with an Aurelia deck, the new Aurelia, where obviously you want everyone to be attacking all the time. So this is a pretty fantastic fit there because there's a lot of attacking going on. This is going to pile a lot of counters on itself. But then what? Well, pay 2 and tap, remove 2 oil counters from Argent Dais. So of course, you're for sure at least going to be able to use that ability once, and you can use it right away. Exile another target non-land permanent. Its controller draws 2 cards. So funny enough, I just talked about Oblation in a video a little while back, how no one plays that anymore. And this is doing, very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar because this is repeatable removal. It's great. But obviously you can also use it on yourself, right? You can just use it to draw cards. And for all those people out there that love Oblation for that reason, you're going to love this card. Just exile another target online permanent. So I can exile a treasure token to draw 2 cards if I want to. Pretty fantastic, right? Any deck where you are constantly spitting out some sort of token, whether it be creature token or clue tokens or whatever, this could be a great fit because you can just turn those tokens into card draw. But also, of course, when my opponent plays their Elishnorn or their Vorinclex or their Avacyn, I can also exile that as well. They get 2 card draws. I don't really care. So pretty great removal option and also great card draw option. Really versatile card. Sure, it's going to go on a lot of decks. Let us talk about Shadow of the Second Moon. This one I think is quite a bit more specific than a lot of the other cards on this list, but certainly is going to see play in those decks. 4 blue, Enchantment Aura, Enchant Player. At the beginning of Enchanted Player's post-combat main phase, there is an additional beginning phase after this phase. So we're getting that phrasing again. And of course, beginning phase is untap, upkeep, and draw. So the big parts there is the untap and the draw. You get an extra draw, which for 6 mana, not super great. An extra untap's not bad. It essentially becomes a Wilderness Reclamation in a way, right? So you get to untap all your stuff essentially at the end of your turn, right? As it says here on the reminder text, the end step happens after the added untap, upkeep, and draw. So after your second main phase, you get the untap, then the upkeep, then the draw. So you can't untap and cast a bunch of stuff unless it's at instant speed. But it is really good, especially in a blue deck, to be untapping your lands, right? It's totally okay to tap out on your turn because then after your second main phase, you will get an untap, so you can counter stuff, Cyclonic Rift, whatever you want to do. That's great. An extra draw is also great, but where this particularly fits is any of those decks where you want an extra upkeep. So if you already have a Paradox Haze in your deck, and there are a few commanders that certainly want an extra upkeep, this is probably a slam dunk for you because the untap and the draw are great, but getting the extra upkeep is extra great. Dog Umbra is a card that I really like from this set. This is a really neat card. It's just a common, probably not getting a ton of buzz, but I think it's a great include in a lot of commander decks. 1 and a white enchantment aura with flash. It has enchant creature. As long as another player controls enchanted creature, it can't attack or block. Otherwise, Dog Umbra has Umbra armor. Pretty neat. And of course, Umbra means if this creature gets destroyed, you remove all damage and you destroy the aura instead. So it's a great way to protect a creature. And of course, because it has flash, you can do it at instant speed. Now, of course, white is already great at protecting creatures. There's better ways to do that. But this is a versatile card. And as I say all the time, I love cards that can affect both my opponents and my stuff. And this can sit in your hand, and someone just cast a board wipe. I flash this out, put it on my commander, and save it from the board wipe. My opponent sneak attacks a Blightsteel Colossus, and before they can declare it as an attacker, I throw this out and enchant their Blightsteel Colossus so it can't attack or block. Also, because it's an aura, it fits in those themes, enchantment themes, right? If I'm playing an enchantment tribal deck, I might just take out my blacksmith skill and put this in. Even though blacksmith skill is better, this is fitting the theme of what I'm doing, and I always like to fit the theme of what I'm doing in my commander decks. So could be an include in decks like that as well. Getting towards the end, yes, I'm almost there. And again, there's even a ton of cards that I probably won't even cover that likely we'll see play in the commander format, but I'm trying to stick to the ones that for sure we'll see play. Harbinger of the Seas is one that you certainly need to be aware of that is available in the commander format now. 1 blue, Merfolk Wizard, 2/2. Non-basic lands or islands. Hoo-wee. Yeah, so this is a blue Blood Moon, which is obviously very relevant because Blood Moon is a very powerful card in the commander format. Obviously, because it's a Merfolk and Wizard, it easily slots into Merfolk Wizard decks. It's up to each individual person. Usually Blood Moon gets played in only mono red decks, so I think this might only get played in mono blue decks because, of course, it's not really going to hurt you at all. I mean, it'll hurt you a little bit. If you got some non-basic lands that are like utility lands, it'll shut them off, sure, but obviously will hurt your opponents way, way more. For me, like a mono blue wizard or a mono blue merfolk deck, this is a pretty easy slot in, right? It's going to give you a huge advantage. Stacks the effect that people don't like. What are you going to do? That's how the game is played, right? So certainly this is a card that we're going to come across from time to time. Let's talk about Glimpse the Impossible, which is a card I imagine is flying under the radar for a lot of people that I thought I would give a mention. It again falls into the strict upgrade category, which is why it will see play in the commander format. 2 and a red sorcery. Exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn at the beginning of your next end step. If any of those cards remain exiled, put them into your graveyard, then create an 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token for each card put into your graveyard this way. Those creatures have sacrifice this creature, add a colorless. Man, that's a whole lot of words on a card. So this card is essentially act on impulse, strict upgrade, right? It is impulse draw, which is why it is a strict upgrade and why it is going to get played in all the impulse draw decks. But it is also just great value. And the reason why I think this card, it might get overshadowed a little bit. But of course, the impulse draw fits in a lot of decks. Mono red decks usually use that a lot just as card advantage. Obviously, the play from anywhere other than your hand theme, all of that and the Exile Tribal is very popular in the format, which this can fit. But also, this can just be a ritual effect, which I think makes it very interesting. Or I guess if you're in a sacrifice theme in red, definitely there are some black-red sacrifice themes. Like this card really is great value. I cast it, I exile the top 3 cards in my library. I can play those cards if I see something I really want to play, but if I don't, I just ignore those cards, and at the beginning of my end step, any of those cards that have remained exile, so if I just leave all 3 in exile, I put them into my graveyard, then I create an 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token for each card put into my graveyard this way. So I can just use this to create 3 Eldrazi spawn creature tokens, which is a fantastic rate. And again, can be used as sack fodder, but also can be used as a ritual effect. If I have a really expensive red commander, I might just throw this in my deck because I can cast it turn 3. Again, maybe make a land drop if I hadn't. I see a land off the top. And then I let the rest go to the graveyard. I get my Eldrazi spawn tokens, which on the following turn help me to get my commander out faster, right? So man, this actually is a really good card, and I think it go in a lot of decks, and it might be flying under the radar for a lot of people. Let's talk about Charitable Levy. This is a really interesting card. 1 in a white enchantment. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, put a collection counter on Charitable Levy, then if there are 3 or more collection counters on it, sacrifice it. If you do draw a card, then you may search your library for a Plains card, put it on the battlefield, tapped, then shuffle. So there's a lot of reasons I like this card. First of all, it is that ramp in white that we don't necessarily need. However, this is not catch-up ramp. This is guaranteed. I go get a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And again, not a basic Plains. I can get a Triumph with this if I want to. You could very easily slot this in a 3 or 4 or even 5 color deck. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Of course, that can be an advantage for you if you're not casting lots of non-creature spells. You could just play this turn 2 and just slow your opponents down. They're going to do it anyway, right? I know a lot of people will say, okay, this card is a non-bow because it wants your opponents to cast non-creature spells, but then makes them cost 1 more. No. They're going to cast it anyway. No one's going to not cast their Arcane Signet. They're just going to have to wait till turn 3 to do it. And when they do, you get a collection counter on this thing. It includes yourself as well, I guess. But for me, this is just, I slow my opponents down a little bit, and then I get a ramp and a card draw out of it. Seems like pretty fantastic value, right? So for me, all those white cards that fit in a 2 mana slot for ramping, this, you might want to look at replacing it with this one because it's not only getting you a Plains card, again, without the catch-up ramp, but also has a couple added advantages as well. I like this card a lot. I will end off, finally, talking about invert polarity, but not for the reason that people think. I think this card might be a chase card from the set, and I am going to try to talk people out of it. It's looking a little expensive already. I suppose it does fit in certain themes, right? So blue, and a red, instant. Choose target spell, then flip a coin. If you win the flip, gain control of that spell, and you may choose new targets for it. If you lose the flip, counter that spell. The theme, obviously, this fits in is the coin flipping theme. That is the one place where I would actually play this card. I wouldn't play it anywhere else, though, and a lot of people will be looking at this card thinking, okay, it's all upside, right? First of all, a 3-mana counterspell in the format, that's not good. And again, I'm not the guy who's saying, oh, go out and play all the best versions of everything all the time. No, but when it comes to counterspells and removal, you do want to keep it on the lower end of the mana value because casting it in that moment, and especially with counterspells, casting it in that moment is all that matters. There is nothing else. If I don't have 3 mana up when my opponent casts the spell that I want to use on this, then it's useless to me. So with counterspells, you really want to make sure, and 3 mana for me is, even Counterflux, I don't know if I would play anymore because I really want my counterspells to be low mana value. And a lot of people will point out some really fantastic scenarios like somebody cast a time stretch, stuff like that. Okay, but then again, this just becomes that spell that just sits in your hand and you're leaving 3 mana up waiting for that moment. You're waiting for your opponent to cast a time stretch or a cyclonic rift or whatever. The situation where it's all gravy, countering it is of course great, but gaining control of it is even better. A lot of people are going to love that situation. I will warn you though, I'll just say, there are also the situations where gaining control of it is also not great. If your opponent is casting a Wrath of God and you want to counter it, Well, guess what? You're going to flip a coin, and what if you gain control of that spell? Gaining control of Wrath of God doesn't change anything. You're still going to destroy all creatures, right? So that would be my only cautionary tale here. This can be a really fun, can be a really powerful card in a commander game without a doubt, but there are going to be situations where you just really want to counter that spell and gaining control of it doesn't do anything for you, right? So be careful with that, okay? The coin flipping can be a bad thing here for sure. All right, that is it. That is all finally. And I do have one more video talking about Modern Horizons 3, of course, the commanders. I haven't even scratched the surface with the commanders. And funny enough, I usually am really on the commanders when sets are coming out. And this one does have quite a few commanders, as every set does. But because the 99 cards from the set were so bonkers that I was just, I think like a lot of people, you're paying way more attention to the 99 cards than the commanders. Certainly the 99 cards from this set are going to be way more impactful in the format than the commanders are. You guys let me know what are the cards you're going after, and of course likely the cards I didn't even talk about in any of my videos that you're going to be playing in your commander decks. I'm sure there's a bunch because there's just like 90% of the cards from this set are likely going to be cards that we are going to be seeing in the commander format. Let me know in the comments below though. That is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.